Broadcasting from the Cass Corridor in Detroit, this is The Metro, a slice of news, culture, and conversation. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. Today on the program, in his first week, President Trump has been busy signing a lot of executive orders and pardoning a lot of people.
We'll explore those orders and pardons, and we'll speak with one Michigander who was just pardoned by Trump.
With all this in mind, we want to know, what do you make of Trump's first days in office? We'll take your calls.
Also, we know there's a lot of vacant land in Detroit. A land bank is supposed to oversee that land, and discussions centered on it have been heating up. We'll find out why. But first, if you follow immigration policy or your life is affected by those policies, you may be feeling some whiplash. That's because on his first day back in office, President Trump signed multiple executive orders meant to profoundly reshape the immigration system. They include suspending a person's ability to seek asylum through the southern U.S.-Mexico border and expanding something called expedited removal. That allows immigration officers to quickly deport someone without a court hearing. Now, one of the most controversial orders the president enacted is being challenged in the courts as we speak.
That is right, Robin. Yesterday, a federal judge in Seattle struck down Trump's new order that would end birthright citizenship. It would mean people born in the U.S. to parents who aren't U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents would no longer have citizenship. It's now the subject of multiple lawsuits, including one filed by Michigan's Attorney General, along with attorneys general in 21 other states. Meanwhile, locally, photos of federal immigration agents patrolling Southwest Detroit, where a big chunk of the Latino community lives, have been circulating on social media. To discuss what all this means for residents here, we're joined by Christine Sauvé of the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center. Christine, thanks for joining us on the Metro.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, Christine, the president signed 10 executive orders and proclamations this week about immigration. These moves are not all that surprising. They were central to Trump's presidential campaign promises, but we have yet to understand their full ramifications. From your perch as an immigration advocate, which of these orders are most concerning to you?
Well, there's a number of the orders that are concerning, and then there's also a slew of policies that have rolled out as well. So as you mentioned, top of the line there, one of the most concerning is the call to end birthright citizenship. That would really aim to create a subclass of American residents that don't have the same rights and privileges, and really would roll back 150 years of history and even longer based on common law before that. You know, we passed the 14th Amendment really to undo the horrors of slavery, and we don't want to go back to an era where politicians decide who and who doesn't belong and who gets the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. So that is the most concerning. It would have the widest impact on children born to immigrants in the United States without lawful permanent status, and with if they have temporary status as well. So we were glad to see the challenges and the that order blocked for 14 days. But there's a number of other orders that were also very concerning.
How unprecedented are these orders and policies? Have we seen anything like this before?
These are much stronger than the last Trump administration, and many of these policies we have not seen the likes of before. Some are repeats from the last Trump administration. I should say up front, immigration is a hot topic, but there are so many misconceptions, and it's a very complicated and complex field of law. So there's a lot of misconceptions about what is really happening. just so everyone has the same context for this conversation, I just want to flag that there's a broad spectrum of immigration statuses, from folks who have deferred action to parole to green cards to naturalized citizens, and then people who may be underdocumented or undocumented face the most significant barriers and exclusions in society. But most people who are undocumented had few, if any, option to obtain lawful status before entering the United States. There just are not enough legal pathways for people to utilize. Unfortunately, we saw the president eliminate some of those lawful pathways. And then once folks are in the United States without authorization, there are very limited options, again, if any, for people to regularize their status. So I just want to let people know that for many individuals that we see through our doors, there just is no line to get in. There's no application or file to form. One of the other executive orders that was very concerning, I would say, is the change in enforcement priorities. So that means that ICE is conducting more enforcement actions and is no longer operating under the priority enforcement policy that would seek only limited number of individuals who have committed a crime.
Hey, Christine,
Which
just really quickly, how long had that policy been in place before it was changed?
the priority enforcement policies date back to the Obama era. Trump did eliminate that policy the last time around, and that led again to casting this wider net of folks who could then be deported. And then the other major policy that was rescinded this week was the long-standing sensitive locations or protected areas policy. And that had been in place since 2011 and had actually not been rescinded under the previous Trump administration. So that is a new era for us.
And just, staying on this particular topic, you talked about it just now. One of those new policies under Trump is rescinding a policy that protected people from immigration enforcement when they are at schools, hospitals, or churches. You said that was in place since 2011. Can you talk about it being that? Talk just a little bit about that new space and this new place that you're in with this particular new policy.
Yeah, it's creating a lot of fear. And I think that is one of the aims of this administration. Again, most Americans want to see a practical, humane immigration system that is modern and functioning and efficient and fair. And all of the actions we saw this week really go in the opposite direction. And one of the efforts is to create fear, which then pushes people further into hiding, and removes people from functioning and participating in the full life of our communities. And that really is at the heart of the sensitive locations policy. So there was a longstanding recognition that, our neighbors have the right to go to school, to access health care, the right to worship, and have religious services and seek shelter and social services. So traditionally, immigration enforcement actions were limited at those locations. Removing that layer of protection really means that more people, their health and safety will be endangered. We also don't want to overstate the impact of the change. Again, it's a very difficult decision for families to make, and this complicated risk assessment of how to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. But again, children still have the right to access a public school education. There are other federal statutes and state statutes that protect those rights. And there are ways that schools can limit the intrusion of immigration enforcement by putting good policies in place, making sure front desk staff know what to do, making sure that ICE has a signed judicial warrant when they come to the school. often they only have an administrative warrant, which doesn't have the same authority. So we do want folks to know that they still have rights, including their constitutional rights, and to seek services when they need to.
And just really quickly, are they still safe places in these especially in Southwest Detroit? Are they still safe places, or are we, like you said, that fear is completely taking over?
Fear is really wreaking havoc in the community right now. We have heard reports from schools where half of the students did not come to school yesterday. And that is really just heartbreaking. As a Detroiter, as a member of, the Metro Detroit community as well, it's just, again, it goes against all of the American values that I grew up with and believed in, that, we value the contributions of our neighbors. It also makes me think of my own my grandfather was an immigrant. My great-grandfather came as an undocumented, unaccompanied minor without a visa, because you didn't need a visa when he came. And his journey would not be possible today. And I think so many Detroiters and Michiganders and Americans have those stories of family members who were able to come and be welcomed in our communities. And it's, again, heartbreaking to see that fear rippling through the neighborhoods. So we do hope folks are aware that they do have rights and get familiar with their rights. We have guides for families to kind of prepare their documents, get familiar with what they can and cannot do, or recommendations if ICE comes to the door. We recommend that they do not open the door. ICE should have, again, that judicial warrant. That can be difficult to assess in the moment, so the safest thing to do is to just not open the door. And it's helpful for parents to have passports for all their children in case a parent were to be detained, or in case of family separation, the family would be able to reunite or travel together. It's very difficult to get passports when a parent is in detention. So we recommend folks do some of this preparation in advance in case enforcement does touch their family.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent alongside Tia Graham. We're speaking with Christine Salve of the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center about Trump's executive orders aimed at reshaping the immigration system. Very briefly, Christine, have you heard from school or church leaders since the order? Have any of them told you they'll still provide sanctuary without the legal protections they once had?
Well, there aren't options to provide true sanctuary, I would say. And sanctuary is a very complex word without a legal definition. So it has different interpretations. Generally when folks say they want to provide sanctuary, they want to protect their neighbors. They want to help ensure that our immigrant community members are not being unduly targeted by immigration enforcement. So unfortunately, a lot of these sanctuary congregations that attempted to do work under the last Trump administration, it would be very difficult to do the same activity under this administration now that the sensitive locations policy has been removed. Schools, again, do still have other federal and state statutes to follow. So there are protections there that are still in place. So there are schools that can put good policy, really best practices in place, regardless of who's the president. And again, that protects students' information. There's federal law protecting who has access to that. If ICE comes to the school, again, making sure the frontline staff reach out to perhaps the school district attorney or legal counsel who can review that warrant to make sure it's a judicial warrant. And if they don't have a judicial warrant, they can turn them away.
I want to discuss more deeply what these policies mean about deportations. They can be really disruptive to families and communities. People are apprehended, and sometimes their family doesn't hear from them again for weeks or months. Talk about the ripple effects of deportations.
They're really damaging to communities, to families, and to communities, and again, our broader economy and social life. We have seen when, for example, workplace raids take place. You know, a lot of times there's no one to pick up the child from school. In towns where that's happened, the sheriff's office gets flooded with calls because you have children who are home alone with no one to care for them. So that is one of the reasons why in our Know Your Rights family preparedness booklets, we do encourage individuals to think about who could be called on if you were to be detained, so that you have a plan in place for someone to pick up your child. And school districts can have more than one emergency contact on file. So maybe not just the two parents, but maybe additional emergency contacts. So those are good, prudent steps to take. But, you know, it has psychological effects on the family. There's been public health studies that really look at the lasting effects on children. To date, either follow-up interviews with children in some of the towns where workplace raids have taken place. You know, the children are still afraid of being separated again from their parents.
Yeah.
And then, as I said, it affects our economy as well. Many of our immigrant neighbors fill valuable roles in our economy. They contribute billions in taxes, and we need them and want to continue our community life with them.
And just as you've outlined those many different ripple effects and the trauma that we know kids are facing when they come home and their parents aren't there, we also have to acknowledge immigration hardliners argue that if someone doesn't go through the proper channels to be in the U.S., they shouldn't be here. What's your response to that?
My response is first that there are so few proper channels. So again, the pathways to come to the United States are extremely limited. So even if someone wants to go about it completely lawfully, for many people there is no way. And so that is what forces many folks to take greater risks in how they enter the United States. And then again, if someone overstayed a visa, for example, then there's very few to no ways to correct that later on. So we do need more pathways to citizenship. Again, polling indicates that the majority of voters would rather see a pathway to citizenship than mass deportations. And yet here we are, having these conversations. Again, I think there's more practical solutions that we could look at, and instead, it's not just at the presidential level. We also saw in Congress this week a very targeted bill that will affect immigrant families for years to come.
And what bill are you talking about? The Lake and Riley Act?
Yes, the Lake and Riley Act. We were appalled to
So
see
that bill, if I could jump in, that's requiring undocumented immigrants who are arrested for theft or violent crimes to be held in jail pending trial. And both of Michigan's Democratic senators, Gary Peters and Alyssa Slotkin, voted yes on the bill. I actually want your opinion on something about this bill. It drew a lot of bipartisan support. Do you feel like the Democratic Party is still pro-immigration, given that? I mean, you just said that you feel this is going to be hugely deleterious, hugely harmful for immigrant families.
Yes, well, we are a 501c3, so we don't take sides per se, but I will point out that our congressional delegation, our senators, our representatives, they pretty much rolled out the red carpet on this one, kind of paving the way for the mass deportation efforts to begin. The law targets undocumented people who are accused but not convicted. A conviction is not required of certain low-level crimes, including shoplifting. And then it exposes them to indefinite detention. These are limitations on due process that we would not accept under any other circumstances for any other group of people. It really perpetuates, inequities that we already have in the immigration and criminal justice systems. It unfairly targets people of color most often. And again, there was no minimum age for children. And so there are many children that could easily get swept up into this. So you can imagine, a father and a child in a gas station, and if the child takes a piece of candy from the front register there, puts it in her pocket, she could be charged with shoplifting, and she could be detained indefinitely without bond. It would be mandatory detention in an ICE facility. These are things that go way beyond. They're more extreme than proposals we've seen in the past.
Christine Salve of the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, thank you for helping us to think about this issue, and thank you for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
Coming up at 11, we'll continue talking about President Trump's actions in his first week in office, including pardoning January 6th rioters. What do you make of President Trump's first few days in office? The phone lines are open, 313-577-1019. Coming up next, the Michigan legislature is back in session, and there's been a lot to keep a track of. We'll catch up with Capitol reporter Colin Jackson.
We'll be right back on the Metro. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. At the end of last year, House Republicans walked out of the final session and refused to participate in a vote unless their concerns, particularly around the tipped minimum wage, were addressed. The legislature is back in session, and Republicans now have control of the House and are taking action. And Governor Whitmer have already signed a number of bills into law. Joining us to catch us up on everything that's taking place in Lansing is Colin Jackson, a reporter for Michigan Public Radio Network. Colin, welcome back to the Metro.
Thanks for having me.
Should have got that right off rip, because come on. But anyways.
I'm here.
You're here, exactly.
That's the important part.
So as we stated, not much got done at the end of last year. Briefly, what are some marquee policies that stalled at the end of the House session last year that's being addressed now?
Well, one of the main things that's actually being addressed now that's come up in the Senate, at least, is open government legislation. So right now, Michigan is one of few states in the country that don't allow you to file Freedom of Information Act requests for the governor and the legislature. So that means while you can ask for what's going on with your local governments, maybe your city council or your mayor's office, you cannot ask those same things of the legislature and request documents of your governor either. So those are the first. So that was a long-standing piece of legislation that past legislatures have also tried. They've always died in the legislature. They passed the House 2 different sessions. Last year was the first time ever it passed the Senate. That created some excitement that, maybe this is going to happen. Well, it didn't happen. So now the Senate, they brought it back as the first 2 bills introduced.
Nice. Oh, no, wait a minute, because I'm writing down, taking my
You're
notes.
good. And then something else, too, just to bring up as well. This was something else that died in the House with that Republican walkout, as well as the lack of a quorum among Democrats, too, was the so-called momnibus bills. And this is pieces of legislation sponsored by Senator Erica Geiss. These would basically target that disparity gap in maternal health care between Black mothers and other mothers. And this is legislation that was reintroduced, I believe, this week in the state Senate.
All right. And let's start with the tipped minimum wage. Starting in February, very, very soon, the minimum wage will increase each year until 2028 when it reaches about $15 an hour. The lower tipped minimum wage will increase each year until it's phased out in 2030. So House Republicans are not in favor of the changes to the tipped wage. What are they doing about it now that they have control of the chamber?
So this was the main issue for House Republicans coming into this year. And you saw this as evidenced by the fact that this was the first committee that they created that had full membership assigned to it. These were the first bills introduced, like the FOIA legislation was the first bills introduced in the Senate. Minimum wage and sick leave bills were the first ones introduced in the Michigan House. So these saw two different committee hearings, I believe last week. Time is all jumbled up, so forgive me if it was 2 weeks ago. But they pushed them out of committee. They voted on them yesterday. These were bipartisan votes, so they did have some Democratic support as well on them. But basically, right now, as you have mentioned, in February 21st, the state's minimum wage is set to jump up to, I believe, over $12 an hour. And that's going to start phasing up each year. It's going to go up by a certain amount. And then to 2028, I believe, it gets a little wonky here. Mm-hmm. And then after that, it's dependent on some different economic factors, what the continual state increase is after that. Along with that is, and this is the bigger sticking point, the minimum wage for tipped workers, servers, bartenders, etc. Right now, they make 38% of what the minimum wage is, or at least employers are required to pay them 38% of what the minimum wage is. And then if their tips don't cover that gap between what that 38% number is and the rest of the actual minimum wage, then employers have to pay them out. But the idea is that tips will cover that gap and then some. So Republicans have been very much still pushing, and some Democrats for that matter, again, these were bipartisan votes, have been pushing to keep that tipped wage credit, as it's called, lower, because under the plan that would come forward on February 21st it would jump to, I believe, 60%. Again, a little bit wonky. I apologize if my numbers are off. And then every year after that, until 2030, it would go up by a certain amount until employers, restaurant owners, bar owners, et cetera, will be responsible for paying those tipped workers the full minimum wage credit. And this was something where there was a lot of pushback, especially among restaurant and business and hospitality industry groups.
Yeah. And just jumping back to paid sick leave, because you talked about that as well. Paid sick leave is up for discussion in both chambers in the state legislature. Where does each party stand on this policy now? You said both sides, yeah.
Yeah, so it's hard to say that there's a hard party line. On Republicans, there is a clear party line. They say that the proposal that would go into effect is going to be damaging for businesses. Basically, the sick leave policies, and again, it gets a little confusing because these are very kind of hyper-technical things, but essentially it would set accrual amounts for sick leave for basically more or less all Michigan businesses that are employees that are employed by the federal government. If you are working for a bigger business, you would have to get a certain amount of time guaranteed paid sick leave. And then if you're working for a smaller business, it would just be guaranteed sick leave, but wouldn't necessarily be paid each year up to a certain amount. And this also depends on how many hours you work. There were concerns about employee accountability for how you're using that sick leave. Under the policy set to go forward, employers wouldn't necessarily be able to compel you to explain why you're using the sick time until your third straight day missed. So there was a lot of talk about whether or not that would lead to people no call, no showing, et cetera. And so Democrats and Republicans have their different proposals for how to fix this, and those are both kind of equally wonky a little bit. But these were, again, something that Republicans had heavily supported, and Democrats were a little bit more split. Democrats, you saw some support from the side of the aisle to change things a little bit. Not always that same amount of urgency that Republicans have to change things by the February 21st deadline. And not to over-explain a little bit, but this kind of goes back to 2018 when Republicans decided to make these bills into law in the first place and then substantively weaken them before they actually went into effect. And that led to a lawsuit, which brought us to this point right now. So you still see a lot of sentiment on the Democratic side of the aisle that this was a Republican-created problem, and why should we deal with it?
You're listening to The Metro on 101.9 WDET-FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're talking to Michigan Public Radio Network reporter Colin Jackson to get an update on all that's been happening in the halls of power in Lansing. So, Colin, Governor Whitmer has signed a bill package to expand reproductive freedoms and contraceptives. What does that package entail?
Yeah, so this is kind of one of several attempts we've seen throughout the entire 23-24 legislative session aimed at expanding reproductive health care. This one of the main things is allowing pharmacists to prescribe birth control. There's other legislation that would also deal with like supporting doulas and I believe freestanding birth centers as well. So this would be separate than kind of that so-called momnibus package I mentioned earlier that didn't make it through the House. These were House bills that made it through the Senate at the end of the year and now have become law.
Okay, so speaking of the House, Whitmer also vetoed a number of bills that were passed by the Democratic-led House when it was led by Democrats. No longer it is. Can you explain what exactly happened there?
Yeah, so I would say the most notable vetoes, at least the ones that stood out to me, were the ones around petition sampling. And again, as with anything in the Michigan legislature, these kind of come down to complicated issues. But the simplest way is if you have a memory that stretches back to 2022, I know that's a long time ago now, but you saw there was a lot of issues with signature gathering, specifically signature fraud and the way that the state elections board, the board of state canvassers, evaluated those signatures to see whether or not they were valid or not on petitions, nominating petitions or for like ballot initiatives to see if you got enough signatures to make it to the ballot. And so these bills were kind of looking to codify random sampling. And basically saying if we'll take a random sample and say if this number is valid, then the signatures will be good. And there was some pushback, especially from Republicans, saying we need to individually look at all of these things. I believe the state elections board and some others were saying this is exhaustive. Random sampling should be good enough. We'll trust the mathematical numbers. I'm not a mathematician, so I can't say one way or another. But this was something where I do believe reportedly Whitmer in her veto letter, I haven't read it myself, but MERS reported this, and I believe some other outlets, that Whitmer did feel like that policy, codifying that policy, went in the wrong direction when it came to election integrity.
So you're not that good with numbers, Colin Jackson. Is that why you became a journalist?
Words are a much better thing. I have the best words.
But we do actually have to work with numbers a lot. Luckily, there's something called calculator.com.
Yeah. Ooh, beautiful.
So the state Senate Democrats, they authorized a lawsuit against the House over stalled legislation that didn't make it to Whitmer's desk. What bills exactly are the Democrats fighting for? And do you think they're going to get their way?
So these were 9 bills that were passed at the very last moment at the end of the legislative session. There was that all-night Senate session. They went back to the House. The House had, at that point, one more scheduled session day in 2024, which was New Year's Eve. There wasn't a voting day. There was no attendance. House lawmakers didn't actually show up to that day. But they still had technical even though the lawmakers weren't still in office, their staff, the House clerk's office, they were still in charge up until the point when Republicans were sworn in and their new clerk took over. And that day when all the lawmakers were being sworn in, there was this mad dash to get a lot of these bills that were passed, enrolled, printed, procedurally sent over to the governor. That didn't all happen. There were 9 bills left when Republicans took control. Speaker Matt Hall, the Republican, he said that he told his people to hold up. Let's wait on what he calls a legal review. So now Republicans are conducting what that legal review at the moment. Democrats are saying, that's taken long enough. So this week, the Senate passed that resolution, as you said, to authorize a lawsuit to compel the House to send these bills to the governor. The state constitution says all bills passed by the legislature have to go to the governor. It says nothing about a timeline. And Speaker Matt Hall is even saying right now, well, is it even constitutional for a future legislature to forward bills to the governor passed by a past legislature? And this isn't really an issue that we've seen come up in Michigan before. Typically, legislatures finish their job before the new one gets sworn in. And so we'll see what happens. You asked about some of the pieces of legislation these deal with. That would include things like allowing corrections officers and I believe some DNR conservation officers to access to the state police pension fund. This includes, allowing historical museum villages. Specifically, I believe this was tailored toward the Detroit Historical Museum to allow to kick off a string of events that could lead to maybe a tax millage, like similar to what the DIA receives, to help with funding as well. There is things dealing with lowering health insurance premium costs for state employees. Those were some of the bigger items.
Okay, Colin, as briefly as you can, now that there has been this shift in the legislature, we have the Democrats controlling a chamber, we have the Republicans controlling another. What kind of shifts are you observing? What do you think we should expect out of the legislature this session in 30 seconds?
Well, in the House side, because that's where the real changes have been, we've seen a lot more pushes to create more subcommittees that would deal with oversight or even spending. We've seen this big emphasis on government accountability and spending coming from Republicans. How that translates to something that could also make it past the Democratic-controlled Senate and governor's office remains to be seen. But I do expect the House to be a little bit more in House Republican leadership where it's trying to assert its independence.
And do you think the House Republicans will be emboldened by Trump, perhaps, to push for more conservative policies?
I don't think that's such a far fetch. I think that's a possibility. But again, it would still need to get past the Democratic Senate and governor.
Colin Jackson is a reporter with the Michigan Public Radio Network. Colin, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up at 11, President Trump has taken a lot of action in his first week back in the White House. He pardoned 1,500 people charged in relation to the January 6 attack on the Capitol, withdrew from the World Health Organization, and is trying to end birthright citizenship. So what do you make of President Trump's first few days in office? Give us a call. The phone lines are open, 313-577-1019.
And up next, Detroit City Council wants to change its contract with the city's land bank, but that process could be really complicated. And what is this land bank exactly? We'll talk with the Detroit documenters about all of that and a little more coming up on the Metro.
Welcome back to the Metro, and happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
I'm Tia Graham. I forgot who I was for a second. I'm so sorry, guys.
I'm here to remind
Thank you.
I'm here to ground you.
Thank
to
you,
tell
because I
you're
did
the
forget who I was.
amazing and splendid and exuberant Tia Graham, and I'm Robin Vincent.
It's been a long week.
We're once again joined by the Detroit documenters. They train and pay residents to cover local government meetings in Detroit, and they take thorough notes on everything that local leaders are saying and that they're not saying. And they, in turn, help us all better understand what's going on in Detroit. And we're here today to talk because at Tuesday's Detroit City Council formal session, Detroit's land bank was a hot topic. What is a land bank? They're community-owned entities that manage, acquire, and maintain vacant property. About 75 communities have land banks across the U.S. That's according to the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Detroit's land bank was created in 2013. And according to the land bank, 90,000 properties went into the bank and about 60,000 are left. The city council would like to change their contract with the land bank, but it's kind of tricky. Detroit documenter Ben Haddix and coordinator Linnell Hurden joined the show to explain. Welcome back, Linnell, and hello, Ben.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, Linnell, what is the Detroit Land Bank?
Right. I mean, just exactly what Robin said. Like,
It's an agency, so the city agreed, I think it was 2009.
Oh, okay.
The city agreed to, I could be wrong, but it was back then, to acquire, to set up this agency to take over the selling of all of these public properties. And, at the time, there were a lot of vacant and blighted properties too. And so they've been in charge of selling all the public land, getting it into private hands.
And just really quickly, Linnell, if you could just kind of set that stage for folks who aren't familiar with what you're talking about. We talk about the time in 2009, even 2013, what the city of Detroit looked like in terms of the homes they were gobbling up in that land bank. What was the city looking like at that time?
Right, yeah, a lot of vacant, abandoned buildings, burned down buildings, homes, vacant land. So not just vacant, but blighted.
Yeah.
So.
And this was the solution that the city decided to take in order.
To give it to an agency that could really handle that work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Linnell, help us with some common government lingo because you guys are always there. What that's used in a meeting? So, MOU.
A memorandum of understanding. It's an agreement, a contract.
And that's what happened between the Detroit Land Bank and the city of Detroit.
Right. They set up this agency so now they own the properties. And their job is to sell them to developers, to residents, to, whoever can get it back to productive use. And that's what they've been doing for since at least 2013, the past 10 more plus years.
Wow. And Detroit Land Bank is formed 2013-ish. We have a clip from David Whitaker, director of Detroit's Legislative Policy Division, and the land bank was actually created in 2008. So we were all just a little bit off with those numbers.
Listen, we'll talk about it. Yeah, go ahead.
But that does speak to
exactly
the work that you all do and the transparency or lack thereof that were coming out of those council meetings. So that is a correction that we have in there. So Detroit's land bank formed in 2008, and we do have a clip from David Whitaker, director of Detroit's Legislative Policy Division, talking about challenges the city was facing at that time.
It's an independent unit of government, and the city turned over a whole 90,000 of its properties to the land bank. They own these properties now, not the city. So that has happened already, and you did that because the city was not managing the property correctly and didn't have the authority to clear title. I mean, that was really the move. The city had property it couldn't manage.
So, Ben, bringing you in, 2013 was a pretty long time ago, or actually 2008 was a pretty long time ago. And when we talk about the thrift stop song, Macklemore was the most popular song. How does this all complicate all of this when we think about just everything that's happening in Detroit and the land bank?
How does it complicate?
So we're thinking about this, the time of, and everything that was going on during the Detroit Land Bank. Just speaking from your perspective, what were the heights of the Detroit Land Bank, and what were some of the things that you learned about it?
Well, just in terms of this Tuesday city council meeting, I'll just speak to, I think there's maybe some certain council member Benson was speaking to a kind of people were forgetting what it was like then. That's why the land bank is important, because people are forgetting what it was like. We need the land bank. Now we're at a different place in Detroit, maybe, where the land bank maybe is less useful than it was then. Maybe its role has changed over time. So if that answers your question.
No, it does, actually, because you talked exactly about what we're hitting at there. Just trying to paint a picture for folks to understand what, to remember and to understand where the city was then and where we are now and how this possibly needs to be a change. So if you can go into more detail about that Tuesday meeting and some of the other things that you heard, what were the community members saying at that meeting?
Of all of the community members who called, not one person spoke glowingly about their experience with the land bank. Not one person advocated for for example, 10-year contract with the land bank. Some people had a more nuanced, let's extend this out 1 year, let's evaluate, let's send this back to negotiations, because the current contract people found very disagreeable. Also, some people called in with just a general mistrust about the land bank, feeling like the land bank was hoarding properties, prioritizing like out of town developers, white developers, and not honoring maybe past owners of the property or people from that neighborhood.
Which is one of the things that I was interesting to wonder. I was wondering about that from the community members in the Detroit Land Bank and what they've thought about it since its inception. And honestly, hearing 90,000 just down to 60,000, it's not a huge number when we think about the amount of time that the land bank has been up and running longer than since 2008. So it's very interesting to hear what the community had to say. Ben, thank you for that. And if you are tuning in, you're listening to The Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vinson. We're talking to Detroit documenter Ben Haddix and coordinator Linnell Herndon about the Detroit Land Bank and discussions that have been heating up surrounding it. Linnell, what changes does the city council want to make to its contract with the land bank?
Cool. Perfect. So let me just say the 2013 number comes in play and the 10-year number comes in play because that's the last contract they signed in 2013. That's where we're at. And so that actually expired in 2023. And so they've been operating in good faith based on that agreement. So that's where we're at right now. And city council wants the ability. We talked about how this was an independent agency. It's quasi-independent. And you heard, did we hear Sheffield say?
Oh, we're actually going to get to
sorry.
Sheffield in a moment.
So sorry. But we heard Sheffield say this, but just talk about how, I'm sorry, I got all mixed up.
That's
now.
okay. It's Council President Mary Sheffield. She said accountability is the problem with the land bank. Let's just go ahead and listen to that clip right now. This is her speaking with Council Member Gabriela Santiago Romero, who says efforts have been made to negotiate with the land bank.
We essentially fund the Detroit Land Bank Authority every year through our annual budget. So it operates in some regards as a city department, but there's no transparency or accountability that is there because of the authority.
I think the key word here is negotiation, and we've been trying. Our office has submitted some recommendations, and they have not been accepted. So I agree with my colleagues that we vote this down and we come back to the table and we negotiate.
Okay, so we were just hearing from Council Member Gabriela Santiago Romero. Linnell, to enact changes to the land bank, there needs to be negotiations between the three important bodies here, and that's City Council, the mayor, and the land bank. What's the appetite for making these negotiations happen?
Right. They've been negotiating for all this time since the 2013 contract ended in 2023. So it's difficult. There's a great appetite for it because right now, the way it's written, what City Council wants is more power to put people on the board of the land bank and to say, listen, get this application done in 90 days, have a way, they want more accountability. They want to be able to speak on behalf of the people. And they don't have that right now. And then unlike most things that come before City Council, they can all go ahead and agree. But like you said, the land bank also has to agree. And that's where it gets kind of messy and tricky and legal with them being quasi-independent.
Briefly, Ben, what were you hearing about the potential future of the land bank?
Yes, so I believe a third party in these negotiations is also like the mayor and the administration. So the idea of postponing making an agreement could mean going into the next mayoral administration. So I think there was some hesitancy to want to push it back further. Why that is exactly, or I guess what the difference is, I'm not totally clear about. Like, why do we need to rush it? But maybe there's good reason. So that's, I think, a simple answer.
So it could be left up to the next mayor.
Yeah, it does seem that way.
Interesting. Okay, we will be looking to the Detroit Documenters for more as discussions unfold about Detroit's land bank. Linnell Herndon, Detroit Documenter Coordinator, and Ben Haddix, a Detroit Documenter. Thank you both so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thanks
for having us.
taken a lot of action in his first week back in the White House. It's been a whirlwind of executive orders on immigration, on names of landmarks. He pardoned 1,500 people charged in relation to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Robin, he withdrew from the World Health Organization and is trying to end birthright citizenship.
A lot has happened. It's hard to keep up. But we're going to help you to keep up on this. And we also want to hear from you. What do you make of President Trump's first few days in office? You can give us a call at 313-577-1019. We'll hear from someone who was pardoned by President Trump next.
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.
See some of what our witnesses saw on January 6th. Let's see the video, please.
We're boots on the ground here. We're moving on to Capitol now. I'll give you a boots on the ground update here in a few.
Multiple Capitol entries. Multiple Capitol entries. We're still taking metal, sharpened objects, missiles, to include bottles and rocks, and hand-thrown chemical-grade fireworks. This is now effectively a riot.
Those were clips of the January 6th attack on the Capitol played during the first of many January 6th committee hearings. You heard the House Select Committee Chair, Benny Thompson, introduce those clips in his opening statement. 4 of the rioters died during the attack. 140 law enforcement officers were injured. And in the days and weeks that followed, 5 Capitol police officers died, 2 by suicide. Over 1,500 people were charged in relation to the riot. Many were armed with firearms, knives, hatchets, and pepper spray. This is The Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're talking about President Trump's first week in office, and there has been a flurry of activity. It included dozens of executive orders and notable pardons. 1,500 people were pardoned and 14 people had their sentences commuted for their crimes related to storming the Capitol on January 6th. A number of the people who were pardoned by President Trump were from Michigan. Later in the hour, we'll speak with legal expert Barbara McQuade about the boundaries of presidential power. We really want to understand how pardons work.
We really do, Tia, and we'll also dig into executive orders, since Trump has signed more executive orders on his first day in office than any president before him. We'll also be taking calls this hour from you. What do you make of President Trump's first few days in office? The phone lines are open. The number is 313-577-1019. As we mentioned, Trump has pardoned a lot of people who were part of the Capitol riot on January 6 in 2021. One of those people is Ryan Kelley. Kelley is a former Michigan gubernatorial candidate who pled guilty to a misdemeanor charge for his participation on January 6. Metro producer Sam Corey spoke with him about how it felt to be pardoned by the president.
What does it feel like to be pardoned by Trump?
It's a great day for our country to really see, promises made, promises kept by President Trump. He talked about pardoning the J6ers for a long time. And so, for me, It's a good feeling. It's a step in the right direction, I suppose, from a federal government that was weaponized against me, aiming to derail my winning gubernatorial campaign in 2022. The damage has already been done, Sam. I've already served 60 days in a federal prison, paid the fine, went through all the stuff they wanted me to. So you can't get any of that back, but it feels good to have received a pardon from the president.
What was it like to be in prison for those 60 days?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's an experience that, not many people would really want to go after and, have to experience. So, being in prison is, in America, you have a little bit more freedom maybe than other countries. You're able to go to the library, you're able to go work out and, watch TV and all that kind of stuff, but, you can't leave the premise. So there's that, right? You're enclosed to that space. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of people that in prison were definitely Trump supporters. And the fact that I was a J6er, they were friendly, we'll say.
So there were people who really liked you. Were there people who really didn't like you also while you were in prison?
None that really surfaced. I didn't get any type of altercations or anything like that. I think there was more support than opposition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You were, of course, at the Capitol on January 6th. A lot of people have seen those images. They've read the stories. What was it like to be there at that time? Yeah,
it's a day that's going to go down in our history from different viewpoints from different people. There's a lot of people that see it as an insurrection, and there's a lot of people that see it as patriots that were, protesting, exercising their First Amendment rights. And there's things that happened that day. Police officers were assaulted. One thing that is not discussed very much, Sam, that maybe the truth over time will come out more, is that before there was any disruption of the crowd and any of the disorder that started, there was a lot of United States Capitol police officers that were shooting with the rubber bullets, flashbangs and everything into the crowd. So, I think that is one portion that needs to have more light shined on it, is the experience of what it was like to be standing there peacefully, screaming USA, Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem, and having police, attack the crowd. So that was a very interesting component of the day, and we all saw different video images. I saw all that happen with my own eyes, and I also saw police officers walking people into the building, guiding them in. I never went into the Capitol myself, but I saw that happen. I saw people fighting with police officers as well. And so, there was a lot of things that happened that day that still need to have a lot of truth shined on it.
You yourself weren't charged for violence. Prosecutors said that you helped breach scaffolding and you stirred up the mob. You pled guilty to what you did at the Capitol, and your lawyer wrote that you said you never, quote, should have participated in the protests that turned into a riot. I'm wondering if you still stand by that.
Say that quote one more time.
You said that you never, quote, should have participated in the protests that turned into a riot.
I said that? That was a quote I did?
It's what your lawyer said of you.
Yeah, I don't remember reading that or seeing that. I can't make comment on that intelligently.
Okay. There are a lot of Americans, I think, who don't quite understand why there was a riot at the Capitol, why there was an attempt to ensure that the election wasn't upheld. I'm wondering if you can explain why you were at the Capitol, why you showed up on January 6th.
That question's been asked a lot of different times. Throughout my gubernatorial campaign, a lot of people asked that question too. Several people, I don't want to say lots of people have questions about the 2020 election still, and whether or not that was a valid, accurate election. We see the election that we just had in 2024 where, Biden received 81 million votes in 2020, and, all of those people didn't show up to vote for Kamala Harris. Where was the difference in numbers with that? The 3 a.m. ballot drops that we saw at the TCF Center, providing, even more suspicion and many other things around Michigan, around the rest of the United States. So me and many others, we had questions about the validity, hoping that Congress would not certify the election that day and aim to take a look at, for national unity purposes and validity of elections in our country, take a look at what happened to validate certain things. And obviously that's not how it happened, but also the question begs too, Sam, is that why did the January 6th committee lie to the American people? Why did the January 6th scam committee, right? I like to call it the scam committee because it's obvious they scammed people and now they received these pardons from Biden. Why did they need those if they've done nothing wrong? We know they deleted evidence. Why was the American people manipulated about that day? And why did he receive a pardon for back to 2014, to cover all of the things that he did, right? It's because what we saw from 2020 on was not up to par. And, many of us knew at those times when it was happening that, there's suspicious things that are going on and we need to get to the bottom of it. But nonetheless, here we are in a new time in our country with Donald Trump as the president, making big moves on day number 1, 2, 3. Now we're into day number 4. And I think we're seeing a course correct for our country moving forward. Pretty exciting time for America.
If you're just joining us on the Metro, my name is Sam Corey. I'm a producer on the show. I'm speaking with Ryan Kelley, who was pardoned by President Donald Trump for his actions taken at the Capitol on January 6th. As noted earlier, you weren't charged with violence. Instead, it was said by prosecutors that you breached scaffolding and stirred up the mob. I'm wondering if you feel like your actions were a part of the assaults that happened to police officers, including the death of Brian
That's
Sicknick.
a ridiculous question, and it's a ridiculous question.
Why?
That's absolutely ridiculous. There's no violence that was taken part of that day by me. And as a matter of fact, there's a pardon that was offered to me. It was a federal government that was weaponized against me to come after me because I was in a winning gubernatorial campaign in 2022. I was the front runner, and I was arrested for being outside of the Capitol building. I was nonviolent, and I think that's the end of the story.
But you were accused.
Right?
It was claimed by prosecutors, and you were found guilty of this, of stirring up the mob. Do you not think that had any effect on the violence that happened?
What's the charge, right? You're getting off into the weeds right now, right? It was a trespassing charge. And you're getting off into the weeds of things that, what are you aiming to accomplish? Let me ask you that question. Right? What are you aiming to accomplish with all this?
I want to ask you what you think the consequences of your actions were.
I was in prison for 60 days.
Right, but I want to know what you think the consequences of your actions were that day for folks who are around.
A federal government that's weaponized against the American people, right? Talk to me about the BLM riots in 2020.
Well, that's not what we're talking about.
How much damage was done there? Yeah, how much damage was done there?
Yeah, but that's not what this conversation is about.
How much time did you dedicate to your show to talk about the damage that was done then?
We definitely talked about it then, but that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about January 6th.
Yeah, exactly. So I think having the pardon put in place tells a lot of the story. And I think January 6th will continue to be a talking point that will divide our country because people see it so different, so polarizing. Some people see it as an insurrection when it obviously was not. And other people see it as a protest and people exercising their First Amendment right. And while there was things that happened that day that, probably could have been handled a little bit differently, ultimately, in the end, there's pardons put in place by the president.
Do you think they should have been handled differently? I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah, the police never sort of started firing at a crowd. Would you agree with that?
Is that what did they start firing at the crowd first? Is that how that happened?
Have you not done your homework?
I don't believe that's how that happened, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, there you go. That's it. You haven't done your homework. You could be wrong. Well, I appreciate the time today. Okay. This has been a very interesting conversation. I do appreciate it very much. Is there any other final questions that you'd like to ask?
I don't think so, Ryan. I think you answered them. I do appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Sam. I appreciate your time very much.
Same here.
That was Metro producer Sam Corey speaking with Ryan Kelley on Thursday. Kelley is a former Republican gubernatorial candidate in Michigan who pled guilty for his participation in the U.S. Capitol riot on January 6, 2021. He served in a federal prison for 2 months. Kelley was recently pardoned by President Trump. Now, a few notes from this conversation. Flashbangs and tear gas were used by the Capitol Police on January 6, but that happened after the Capitol was stormed. Ryan Kelley also implied that the 2020 election was fraudulent. It was not. Finally, he said the January 6 Congressional Committee lied to the American public. There's no evidence of that.
Coming up, President Trump has taken a lot of action in his first week back in the White House. He pardoned 1,500 people charged in relation to the January 6th attack on the Capitol, withdrew from the World Health Organization, and is trying to end birthright citizenship. So, what do you make of President Trump's first few days in office? The phone lines are open. The number is 313-577-1019.
Next, we'll be speaking with legal scholar Barbara McQuade about how much power the president has. Stay with us. It's The Metro on WDET.
America will reclaim its rightful place as the greatest, most powerful, most respected nation on earth, inspiring the awe and admiration of the entire world. A short time from now, we are going to be changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and we will restore the name of a great president, William McKinley, to Mount McKinley, where it should be and where it belongs.
That was President Donald Trump speaking about one of the executive orders that he was going to make. He has now signed executive orders renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America and Mount Denali Mount McKinley. This is The Metro. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. With just a few days in office, President Trump has taken a lot of actions, specifically executive actions. Since Monday, Trump has signed several executive orders. He declared the U.S.-Mexico border the site of a national emergency. He's tried to end birthright citizenship for those born to undocumented immigrants in the U.S., which a federal judge has blocked for now. He's deregulated oil drilling and pardoned the majority of January 6 defendants charged who participated in a riot on our nation's capital. None of this is terribly surprising. Trump said he'd do so many of these things during his presidential campaign. But what's notable is the testing of his own power, particularly with his attempt to end birthright citizenship, which would repeal parts of the 14th Amendment, making his decision unconstitutional. These executive orders and pardons may be a sign of the Trump era and a sign of how to get things done in a polarized political environment. And so, this hour, we want to delve into the ways the executive branch operates. How do executive orders and pardons work exactly? And why do they exist?
So, Robin, we're opening the phone lines and we want to hear from you. What do you make of President Trump's first few days in office? They are open, 313-577-1019. We want to hear your thoughts as we are talking with our callers. We want to hear from our guest as well, who is really knowledgeable about the law and the executive branch. Barb McQuade is a law professor at the University of Michigan and a legal analyst for MSNBC. Barb, welcome to the Metro.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Tia. Glad to be with you.
Of course. So, Barb, we're seeing a flurry of activity from the White House. We want to delve into how executive orders and pardons work. So let's start with executive orders. First, what is an executive order? Why do we have it? And how does it work?
So an executive order is a president's ability to direct executive agencies to execute the law. It cannot supersede the Constitution. It cannot supersede a statute passed by Congress. What it does is directs federal agencies to do their jobs. So, for example, there's an executive order directing the Department of Justice to aggressively seek the death penalty in all cases in which it's eligible, and has some more detail about that. It's not changing the law. It's just proposing priorities and suggesting that the Department of Justice should be very aggressive in its enforcement, especially in particular kinds of cases. So it is a level below the Constitution and a statute, and gets into the fine-grained details of how the executive branch is supposed to execute those laws.
And President Donald Trump, he did sign the most first-day executive orders of recent presidents at 26. Now, why is this so significant? Was it just to make changes or to also signal a political and cultural shift in the U.S.?
Well, I think part of it is, unlike his first term when he said he didn't really understand how Washington works, he partnered with the Heritage Foundation to develop Project 2025. And many of these executive orders we're seeing are policy proposals that were included in the Project 2025 report. So he had a staff of people ready to go on day one to put these out. I also think some of this is intended to be what they call shock and awe, to shake people up, to send a message that to Trump's supporters, he intends to follow through on his promises, maybe to his critics, to send a message that will resonate with fear and compliance. But I think many of these executive orders really stretch the boundaries of the law. As we said, you can't change the Constitution or a statute with an executive order. And some of these executive orders appear, at least to me, to cross those lines. And we've already seen some legal challenges to some of these just as soon as the executive orders were issued.
And Barb, very briefly, how would you describe Project 2025? What's in this plan?
It's a very, very conservative plan for governing. They call it a blueprint for governing. And so they set out for every executive department agency a plan for reforms to advance a very conservative agenda. You know, putting the family at the centerpiece of American life is part of its preamble. Removing DEI programs is part of it. Cutting back on abortion rights. All of the things that are part of the far right agenda, including some very aggressive enforcement of immigration offenses.
So just briefly, from my own personal understanding now, the Gulf of America, based on the executive orders, that's what it's technically called now, based on those executive orders?
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
The president does have the ability to name places within the United States, but it is subject to the approval of an international organization. And so if you're living in Mexico or Europe, you don't have to acknowledge that Donald Trump now wants to call this the Gulf of America. But for U.S. purposes, he can do that. There is a federal agency called the U.S. Board on Geographic Names. It's a federal body that oversees the standardization of geographic names. Typically, they will review these actions, efforts to change names, and decide whether to approve or reject. But because they're part of the executive branch, typically if a president wants to change a name, that happens. We've seen this now with Mount Denali becoming Mount McKinley in Alaska. That has flip-flopped. President Obama changed it from McKinley to Denali, Trump changed it back, Biden changed it back, and now we're getting it changed back again. So it's a little bit of whiplash, I think, for these kinds of names. But, it is a bit of political theater, I think, for Donald Trump to say we're going to name this after a great American president instead of the Native American tribes who live there.
And Barb, just diving into it, of course, more about the executive orders. Some of these executive orders are enacted and some are being challenged or have other logistical hoops been in place that we have to jump through or has to be jumped through.
Yeah, so oftentimes when you are changing the interpretation, there is a notice and comment period that has to occur through administrative law. So many times when there is an executive order that is sort of pronounced, that doesn't mean it's good law. And sometimes, as we saw in the Biden administration with some immigration orders and with student loan orders, we are seeing legal challenges to these even before we're going through that administrative policy or practice. It is not the case typically that these executive orders can change the status quo on a dime, except when it comes to governing the federal workforce. And there are some, such as hiring freeze and rescinding orders for summer internships, requiring employees to go back to work 5 days a week in the office, demanding that they have gender conforming documentation that conforms with their birth sex. So the things that relate to the federal workforce, they can execute right away. But other things do have this sort of notice and comment period through the Administrative Procedures Act.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're speaking with Barb McQuade, a law professor at the University of Michigan and a legal analyst for MSNBC. We're discussing Trump's first few days in office and the use of executive orders, a lot of them. And we want to hear from you. What do you make of President Trump's first few days in office? Call and let us know, 313-577-1019. And let's go to the phones now. George in Southgate, thanks for calling the Metro. What do you make of President Trump's actions in his first week back at the White House?
Well, Pierre and Robin, thank you for the opportunity. Long-time listener, everyday listener, and donor.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to say, first of all, the opening clip with the police talking about being overrun and how they needed reinforcements. I spent 21 years in the United States Army, and that sounded just like a combat battle to me. I don't know about any peaceful demonstration that Mr. Ryan Kelley was the name, what he was talking about. Made me almost ill to listen to this man talk. But I want to point out that that's the thing about NPR. NPR gave this man a platform to speak, and if the tables were reversed, Fox News wouldn't put me on, just like, So, this is why we need public radio. Because you get information from all sources so that you can make up your mind. And also, the thing about Trump, he's backed by billionaires who happen to own the media. And the media has been portraying illegal immigrants, undocumented individuals, as villains for years now. If there's a crime and it's committed by an illegal alien or, like I said, undocumented person, it's on the front page of the newspapers, all the newspapers. The LA Times, owned by a biotech engineer. The New York Post, owned by Rupert Murdoch. The Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, who was at the inauguration, by the way.
George, thank you. Thank you so much for calling the Metro. And I will say that there are a lot of different depictions about what is happening when it comes to the immigration landscape. And earlier in our program, we were talking to an immigration advocate who certainly was not painting immigrants in that light. Professor McQuade, I want to turn to you. What do you make of President Trump's actions in his first week back? I mean, are you surprised by them? That's more broadly, I'll ask.
I'm really not, because this is exactly what he said he would do. I suppose the flurry and the pace is impressive, that he got so many executive orders signed on Monday. But I think that flurry is an intentional act in an effort to create distractions, outrage, chaos, and perhaps even exhaustion. It allows some things to fly under the radar because people necessarily focus on one or two of those orders. And when there are dozens of orders, it's difficult for people to focus on any one of those kinds of things. So I think this is how President Trump rolls. It does remind me a bit of 2017 when he first took office. I had a student say to me the other day, I forgot how exhausting it is when Donald Trump is president. It reminds me of how things were back in 2017 for those 4 years. Every day brings new news stories almost every hour on the hour. And I think that is a deliberate strategy. If there's some new outrage every hour, it's very difficult to focus on any one. And so perhaps that's part of the strategy.
Professor McQuade, that makes me think back to Trump's Muslim ban and how that very much was a part of the shock and awe playbook. Would you agree with that statement? And do you think we will see some of his future actions rise to that same level?
Yeah, that's such a good example because you may recall that was issued on the Friday after Donald Trump was sworn in. So today, the equivalent of today. In 2017. I was still the U.S. attorney at the time. I had held over for a bit before I was planning to come here at the University of Michigan. Ultimately was fired by Donald Trump in March of 2010. But what happened that day created absolute chaos. At 5 p.m. that night on a Friday night, the order was issued that not only people coming from certain Muslim majority countries could not enter the United States, it included people who are permanent immigrant residents of the United States. So people have been living here for 5 years, 10 years, their whole lives, but were not citizens. If they were from those countries, they were not allowed in. And so that night, of course, there's just chaos at all of our airports across the country as we try to sort it out. By Monday, we had a lawsuit that was filed. Lawsuits filed all over the country, including the Eastern District of Michigan. And I remember wondering, what on earth are we going to do? This is indefensible. How can we defend this? Because if you are a lawful permanent resident, you are considered a U.S. person, which means you have due process rights before any right can be taken away from you. And that was being denied. So we believed it was unconstitutional. And I got an email to all of DOJ at about 6:15 that night from Sally Yates, who you may recall was the Obama Deputy Attorney General who was serving as acting Attorney General at that time. And she said, I am not convinced this is a constitutional order, and therefore I am directing the Department of Justice not to enforce it. I thought, thank you, Sally Yates. I completely agree with you. Thank God. And then, of course, minutes later, she was fired by Donald Trump. So that was a real sign of what was to come. But these orders remind me a lot of those orders, which is they're kind of half-baked. I think they are in some ways pushed to be very aggressive, to push legal limits, if not cross them. And what we saw in 2017 was they had to revise that order twice before they were able to find one that actually complied with the law that they were able to enforce that was ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court. And so I expect we're going to see some similar things with some of these laws, like this birthright citizenship executive order. As a judge said just yesterday in the state of Washington, a Reagan appointee, by the way, that executive order is blatantly unconstitutional. And so I think we're going to see some judges pushing back against the boundaries of these things. But it seems to me that Donald Trump is really flexing his executive powers to see how much he can accomplish, even if he does cross the legal line in some instances.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're speaking with Barb McQuade, a law professor at the University of Michigan and a legal analyst for MSNBC. We're discussing Trump's first few days in office and the use of executive orders. And we want to hear from you. The phone lines are open. What do you make of President Trump's first few days in office? 313-577-1019. But let's get back to the power of the presidency. What happens when the president issues an executive order? Do they automatically go into effect? And how do they actually work?
Well, it really depends on the order. So to the extent that there is some sort of change in the interpretation of the law or the issuance of a new rule, it does go through this notice and comment period. So the executive branch has to notice it in what's called the Federal Register. It has to keep it open for a period of time to receive comment from members of the public. And then after consideration, it can make revisions. And only then after this period of time has passed, can they actually make it part of the law so that it is in place. And so in the meantime, that does give people an opportunity to file lawsuits to try to enjoin them. We saw that this week in this birthright citizenship executive order, for example, where a lawsuit was filed by the state of Washington that said, people in our state are going to be impacted by this order that says people who thought they were U.S. citizens because they were born in this country are under this order, no longer U.S. citizens if their parents are undocumented immigrants. And so they are seeking an order, and the judge said he did impose an injunction which will delay the implementation of this order until it can be litigated in the courts. And that's because, as the plaintiffs allege and the judge found, there's a substantial likelihood that they will succeed on the merits of showing that this executive order violates the 14th Amendment, which specifically says anyone born in the United States is a citizen of this country. It has a very small exception. It says anyone subject to the jurisdiction thereof of the United States. That means all of us who can be brought into court. That means all of us who can be held accountable for crimes. The Supreme Court has held that term, subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, creates a small exception for the children of diplomats and children born to the occupying armies. This executive order attempts to redefine that term, subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, to write out people who are born here to parents who are undocumented. And so this judge has found it blatantly unconstitutional. I think we'll see more of the same. And so it may be some time before some of this most aggressive executive orders actually go into effect.
We're currently joined by Barbara McQuade, a law professor at the University of Michigan and a legal analyst for MSNBC, as we continue to unpack President Trump's first few days in office and the 26 executive orders he's signed so far. And we want to hear from you. What do you make of President Trump's first few days in office? The phone lines are open. It's 313-577-1019.
This is The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. Stay with us.
So we're going to see some of what our witnesses saw on January 6th. Let's see the video, please.
We're boots on the ground here. We're moving on to Capitol now. I'll give you a boots on the ground update here in a few.
Multiple capital entries. Multiple capital entries. We're still taking metal, sharpened objects, missiles, to include bottles and rocks, and hand-thrown chemical-grade fireworks. This is now effectively a riot.
Those were clips of the January 6th attack on the Capitol played during the first of many January 6th committee hearings. You heard the House Select Committee Chair, Benny Thompson, introduce those clips in his opening statement. Over 1,500 people were charged in relation to the riot, and President Trump has pardoned them. You're listening to The Metro on 101.9 WDET-FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Our guest is Barb McQuade. She's a law professor at University of Michigan. We're discussing the beginning of Trump's second term in office, which began Monday. We just talked about executive orders, and now we want to turn to pardons. That's because both President Trump and former President Biden have been doing a lot of them. Before leaving office, Biden pardoned his son Hunter, and in the final hours of his presidency, he issued pardons for Representative Liz Cheney, for Dr. Anthony Fauci, and several members of his own family. Biden fears political attacks from Trump, even though he believes these folks did nothing wrong.
Yes, Robin, Trump came into office with his own set of pardons, pardoning 1,500 people and commuting the sentences of 14 others who were convicted of crimes related to storming the Capitol on January 6, 2021. And that's in hopes of preventing the results of the presidential 2020 election from taking effect. And so we want to dive into those pardons. How do they work? Are they becoming more popular? We also want to hear from you. What do you make of President Trump's first few days in office? The phone lines are open. It's 313-577-1019. 9. Now, Barb, bringing you back into the conversation, why does America have pardons at all?
The pardon power really comes from our English legal tradition. And the idea is that despite conviction for a crime, even if a person was guilty, some people, we believe, are deserving of grace and mercy. And so we give the chief executive the power to grant that even after a person has been convicted and served a sentence. We also give that power to governors who can pardon or grant clemency to people who have been convicted of crimes. It's not without controversy. I think there have been times throughout history when people have questioned whether a person who received a pardon was really deserving of that. We saw Bill Clinton with Mark Rich, who was a big donor, and his own brother. We saw George Bush 41 pardon some of the Iran-Contra defendants who were public officials. But it's there, and the only way we could change it is through a constitutional amendment.
I was thinking as well for former city of Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick as well.
Yes, he got clemency, so
Okay.
he wasn't pardoned, a commutation. His sentence of 28 years was commuted to 7 years. And, you know, I won't speak on the merits of him in particular, but one thing that's noteworthy, I think, about the way Donald Trump used his pardon power at the end of his first term is we saw a lot of his own allies get pardoned, Paul Manafort, Mike Flynn, some of those kind of people. And we saw a number of public officials who've been convicted of crimes of corruption. So people like Governor Blagojevich of Illinois, who had sold President Obama's Senate seat, tried to sell it to the highest bidder, defrauded a children's hospital. Members of Congress, state officials, and Kwame Kilpatrick, among others, who had committed crimes of public corruption. And my concern about that collection of pardons is it tends to forgive, overlook, or even normalize public corruption as just, you know, politics as usual, which I think is something that all of us as American citizens should reject.
And Barb, if we do get back to that, I would love to just touch on it about the normalization of everything that we're experiencing right now and what your thoughts are on that. We'll get back to that if we get time later on. But I do want to continue on with pardons and understanding them a little bit more as you're explaining. Are they unique to the American political system, or does it exist elsewhere as well? And since we're just discussing them, are executive orders also unique to American society?
Well, one of the things we're seeing across the world is a backsliding of democracy. We've seen it in Hungary. We've seen it in Turkey. We've seen it in Argentina. And I think some European countries where we've seen leaders who are pushing sort of an authoritarian regime. And I think part of the problem is we live in a society today where the pace of change has become so rapid. And I also think that income inequality has grown in many countries, leaving people feeling less well off than their prior generations, which is true. And so authoritarian leaders use disinformation to try to blame other scapegoats for the fact that people don't feel as well off economically as they were in the past, when in fact what's really causing it is income policy, taxation policy that benefit the wealthy and benefit corporations over the individual and the working class. I think that's what's causing it. I don't know about how executive orders work in other countries. We have other countries that have modeled and copied the U.S. Constitution as a model for their own democracies. But of course, the way people work out the details varies. And we have seen efforts to gather more executive power in places like Hungary, Russia, Turkey, and Israel, where Benjamin Netanyahu tried to gather more power over the courts. So this is definitely a trend worldwide.
We are taking your calls today, so we do want to go back to those phone lines and talk with Anthony in Westland. Anthony, what do you make of President Trump's first week back in office?
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me on. It's extremely disheartening. In a sense, he promised a number of these different things, and sure enough, he is proving to be extremely competent in doing those things, much to the dismay of people like myself and a number of others. It's really, really hard to watch as I can't remember what your guest name was, but there's
Barb
such an
McQuade,
influx
yeah.
of news coming in. Barb, thank you. There's such an influx of events that are happening, and I think for myself at the very least, I almost feel a little bit of PTSD, or I hate to put it on the same level because I don't think it is the same thing, but it brings me back to 2020, right, where I think everybody was in this sort of panic mode with COVID going on, with all the the first Trump presidency, just in this state of response. And so one thing I wanted to kind of speak to in terms of that, for people like myself and other people who maybe are feeling a little hopeless, a little more than a little disheveled, is just to remember to keep at the fight, organize with your community, get involved. If you don't think politics affect you, they're going to. And ultimately, like, one of the biggest takeaways that I've been holding on to as a piece of hope in this really tumultuous time is that all of the things that he's doing, all of the immediate actions, all of the sort of groundbreaking executive orders that he's doing right now, community organizers are not surprised by this. Right?
Anthony,
this is something that...
Thank you so much for giving us a call. We're going to have to stop you there. I'm Robin Vincent. You're listening to The Metro on WDET. I'm alongside Tia Graham. We're speaking with Barb McQuade, a law professor at the University of Michigan and former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. And we're talking about the power of the presidency, specifically with executive orders and presidential pardons. And again, Anthony, thank you so much for giving us a call. The phone lines are open, 313-577-1019. Professor McQuade, when we talk about pardons and the amount of pardons that Trump has issued, we again need to also look at Joe Biden. Before leaving office, he pardoned his family and a number of other people. Do his actions speak to an era of political retribution as promised by Donald Trump?
I think this is such an important point because one of the things we're seeing, I think, is a false equivalency. Well, Joe Biden was very aggressive in using his pardon power politically, and so there's nothing wrong with what Donald Trump is doing. I don't agree with every pardon that Joe Biden issued. I think he overreached a bit. I don't like the fact that he pardoned the January 6th committee members. I think he feared that they would be targeted because Donald Trump said he would for retributive prosecution. But I think it gives people like Ryan Kelley the fodder to say, oh, well, they got pardoned, so they must have done something wrong. So I don't love all of the pardons by Joe Biden. However, the pardons of the January 6th defendants, in my view, are completely different from anything we have ever seen before. More than 1,500 people, many of whom engaged in violence. And part of the message has been that somehow they were denied due process or that they were railroaded in their cases, that they were peaceful protesters. Those are just not true facts. They engaged in violence. They harmed police officers. 9 people died that day, including 4 police officers who committed suicide because of the trauma they experienced that day defending the Capitol from these violent attackers. More than 160 of them used weapons. Hundreds were violent. And so we are getting a false equivalency here in suggesting that they were somehow railroaded. They got due process in the courts. They had representation by attorneys. They had independent judges handling their cases and sentencing them to crimes. And so those are all just false statements. And by pardoning people who engaged in political violence, I believe Donald Trump is normalizing that behavior and emboldening them and others to engage in political violence as long as they believe it is in service of the leader. It will not just be overlooked, it will be encouraged.
Professor McQuade, I want to stay on the topic of the insurrection and how these pardons are normalizing this kind of violence. The insurrection was unprecedented, and so in turn these pardons were as well, as you have pointed out. So you've discussed how you think this could foment additional political violence. How do you think that these actions could reshape the office of the president when it comes to a president's power?
I think this is going to be an interesting test because the current makeup of the Supreme Court does have members on it who have expressed a view that presidential power has been not fully exercised. They have a view of very strong presidential power. Certainly, Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh have written extensively about this view. And so I think one concern I have is that they will use these opportunities to expand presidential power. One of the things that one of these executive orders relating to the death penalty has said is that Donald Trump directs his attorney general to seek to overturn Supreme Court precedent. That is, an effort to push the court in a new direction. And so, the Supreme Court is only supposed to overturn precedent if circumstances have changed or the law has become inconsistent with new law that has shaped around it, or that has become unworkable in practice, not simply because a new set of justices has a different opinion about what the law should be. Precedent and stare decisis is what provides stability in our government, fair notice about what the law requires, and predictability for policymakers and businesses and individuals. But I worry that Donald Trump will receive a receptive audience in this current Supreme Court, and we may see changes in the law to expand presidential power.
Professor McQuade, you've given us so much to think about, and I thank you for that. In the last 30 seconds that we have, a number of political commentators, both liberal and conservative, have been saying that the old rules of politics are changing. Are our laws losing their power to the president, as briefly as you can?
I worry that it is. I mean, I think what we see in Donald Trump is a president who is willing to push the limits of the law, even if it means crossing the line of the law to expand presidential power. So it could be that we see a presidency that is transformed by Donald Trump and not perhaps in a way that most of us in a democracy want to see it.
Barbara McQuade is a law professor at the University of Michigan and a legal analyst for MSNBC. Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro today.
Thank you both.
That is the Metro for January 24th, and this is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.